Hello, friends. If you're hearing this, then it means the time has come to set aside the worries of the day and slip into another century. A world of veiled hats, a scent of lavender, and the rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestone streets. Welcome to England, the latter half of the 19th century. The Victorian era, prim, reserved, and seemingly proper, like a glove buttoned all the way up. But beneath that smooth leather, something unsettling stirred. Picture a quiet drawing room. Fine porcelain trembles with the delicate stir of a spoon. A woman in a crinoline gown sits by the window, her gaze distant. She feels no pain. Or perhaps she feels far too much. In her hand, a small glass vial filled with amber liquid. It smells sweet, almost comforting. This is laudanum, a blend of opium and wine. In the 19th century, it was as common as a bottle of aspirin is today. In this story, we'll follow that little vial. We'll trace its path into bedrooms, pharmacies, women's bodies, and the minds of physicians. We'll uncover why, in the Victorian era, women became the primary consumers of one of the strongest narcotics, and how society quietly looked the other way. If you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Your attention is the lifeblood of this project. And now, let's begin at the beginning, with pain no one thought was unusual. A quiet morning mist settles over the streets of Bath. Stone facades emerge from the milky haze like crumbling stage sets. In this city, people love hot baths, letters from friends, and small remedies for tension. Somewhere in a high-ceilinged townhouse, a young woman reaches out her hand to a maid. She is weak. The past week, one long, endless headache. Or a migraine. Or maybe that same nervous weakness again. Her husband doesn't notice. He's at the club, and she takes 3 drops from a brown vial, as usual, with breakfast. In the first half of the 19th century, the life of a woman in England could be surprisingly joyless. Not because the world around her was grim. Quite the opposite. Society was evolving, railways expanding, tea was more accessible, and fashion was growing ever more elaborate. But the stricter the corsets became, the tighter the constraints on a woman's role, to be a wife, a mother, a silent angel in the house. No hysteria, no fatigue, no complaints, pain. That wasn't illness. That was destiny. And there was a lot of pain. Chronic inflammation, menstrual agony, postpartum complications, toothaches, migraines, rheumatism, exhaustion. Medical science not only lacked solutions, it often failed to ask the questions. The female body was viewed as something temperamental, mysterious, not to be healed, but managed. Popular theories claimed that the female nature was closer to the Dionysian, unstable, irrational, prone to emotional flares. Male doctors described women's health as a fragile equilibrium, and when that balance was upset, they blamed the womb. Quite literally. Everything from insomnia to depression was attributed to wandering womb syndrome. One doctor even claimed the organ moved around the body, causing fits of laughter, tears, or panic. This wasn't anatomically explained, but it sounded convincing enough to the readers of 1840s medical journals. So what was to be done if a woman suffered? The answer was simple: don't interfere. Or give her something soothing. Folk medicine offered its usual recipes: poppy infusions, valerian, alcohol, and more frequently, opium. Apothecaries in small shops became fixtures of Victorian life. There, among dried chamomile and crushed minerals, stood bottles of potions that promised to calm the nerves and ease headaches. For those who could afford a doctor, things weren't much better. Medical intervention was limited to bloodletting, enemas, and bed rest. But something new was on the horizon. An opium tincture in alcohol, laudanum, felt almost magical. Slightly sweet, thick like honey, it gently swept away anxiety. softened the throbbing in the temples, and made the night pass in silence. And so, in those years, small amber glass vials began to appear more and more often in women's dressing cases and travel bags. They were tiny charms against reality. No one considered them dangerous. On the contrary, they were a sign of refinement, the art of controlling one's emotions. Thus began what would later be called the invisible epidemic. But for now, it was simply part of everyday life. Imagine a doctor's office. The walls are covered in heavy fabric. The soft glow of a lamp flickers, casting shadows on portraits of Hippocrates and Galen. In front of the doctor, a woman. She cannot explain what's wrong. She feels tightness in her chest, cries for no reason. Sometimes she laughs. Sometimes she can't get out of bed. Sometimes her stomach hurts. Sometimes her heart. It's probably hysteria, the doctor says, and makes a note in his journal. With that, the consultation is considered complete. In the history of medicine, there is no diagnosis more flexible, convenient, or shape-shifting than hysteria, and none that has been applied so long and so consistently, almost exclusively, to women. The word hysteria comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. Even in antiquity, it was believed that women's illnesses stemmed from the uterus, losing its place and beginning to wander through the body, causing convulsions, fainting, and emotional outbursts. This theory was passed down from century to century, a convenient explanation for anything that didn't fit a simple scheme: fever, inflammation, wound, blood. By the 18th century, the concept had evolved slightly, but the term remained. And in the 19th century, as Europe underwent the Industrial Revolution, cities grew and new forms of daily life, more isolated, more confined, especially affected women. Hysteria found new life. But what was it in practice? The symptom list of hysteria could rival a department store catalog. Insomnia, tearfulness, depression, chest pain, loss of appetite, irritability, obsessive thoughts, panic attacks, tics, hallucinations, unusual behavior, sometimes heightened sexuality, sometimes a complete absence of it, sometimes the absence of anything at all. Everything fit. If a woman experienced something odd, it could be labeled hysteria. For the doctor, it was a universal label. For the patient, a closed loop. Imagine, you feel like you're losing control of your own body. You seek help. You're told it's hysteria. And at best, you're prescribed fresh air, warm baths, and rest. At worst, enemas, cleanses, or sedative mixtures of alcohol and opium. Sometimes even hypnosis or vibrational therapy, which we'll return to later. Paradoxically, hysteria became especially fashionable among middle and upper-class women. A working woman, burdened with a 6-day work week and children, simply didn't have the time or money to be hysterical. But a bored lady in a townhouse? Quite possibly. There was a social hierarchy here, and a gender politics element too. An intelligent, educated woman who spoke openly about her desires could be labeled hysterical far more quickly than one who quietly embroidered. At times, hysteria became a form of expression. Later, 20th century psychologists would write that it was a socially acceptable way to express protest, internal conflict, or helplessness. A woman couldn't walk out onto the street and scream, "I don't want to be only a wife and mother." But she could fall silent or faint, and in doing so, she forced the world to pay some kind of attention. One of the most common symptoms was the so-called chest lump, a sensation of choking or being unable to breathe. Today, we'd call it a panic attack. Then, it was considered a typical hysterical reaction. Doctors often didn't even try to look deeper. If a woman complained of pain, weakness, fear, hysteria. And if she didn't complain, but looked off, still hysteria. Officially, hysteria was considered a nervous disorder, but not one to be treated, rather one to be endured. After all, in the eyes of society, women were always slightly more emotional, and thus slightly less worthy of rational medicine. One English physician even wrote, "A woman, being a delicate, emotional creature inclined toward fantasy, OFTE, and cannot distinguish between real pain and anxiety." Thus, the very act of a woman speaking about her suffering was discredited. She was an unreliable narrator. And if she also read novels? Dangerous. Her imagination might stir. Her mind become agitated. Her nerves suffer. All of it? Hysteria. At the same time, the diagnosis had a strange upside. For many women, it was one of the only socially permitted ways to escape the crushing weight of their role. If you were ill, they wouldn't make you bear a sixth child. If you were overwhelmed, they'd leave you alone. And therein lies one of the greatest paradoxes of Victorian medicine. A diagnosis meant to belittle a woman could, at times, become her only refuge. And with that diagnosis, doctors began prescribing more than just baths and walks. A drop of morphine, a bit of opium, a tincture of belladonna, or even a spoonful of heroin syrup, then legal and fully approved. Because if the body suffers and the mind is overstimulated, well then, the body must be allowed to rest, even if it's artificial rest. And so hysteria became not just a fashionable illness, but a gateway to an entire world of pharmaceutical comforts. And though it masked thousands of real sufferings for the system, it remained merely a convenient label. The next chapter, what was actually prescribed for the nerves, and how those remedies became a regular part of the Victorian breakfast. The door of an old pharmacy creaks open. The air is thick, smelling of mint, dill, something sweet, and something unsettling. On the shelves, bottles labeled in elegant script, tinct, opi, elix, laudanum, chloral hydrate. The apothecary, in a white apron, lays out powders, mixes a tincture, counts out drops. A woman in a gray shawl waits for her portion, for headaches, or perhaps for the heart, or maybe simply because she can't sleep without it. Victorian England was not only a time of industrialization and moral dogmas, it was also an apothecary revolution. Never before had such powerful substances been so widely available, and never before had the choice of medicine depended so profoundly on the patient's gender. Laudanum was perhaps the most iconic and widely used remedy. A tincture of opium and alcohol, often with aromatic additives, cinnamon, vanilla, sometimes even honey. It was sold in nearly every pharmacy, and rarely by prescription. In practice, almost never by prescription. The opium worked as an analgesic, a sedative, and a mild euphoriant. It slowed the pulse, eased pain, especially menstrual and neurological, and brought on a sense of warmth and quiet. It's hardly surprising that women, living under constant emotional, physical, and social strain, gravitated toward these little bottles. And it wasn't just the poor or desperate. On the contrary, opium became a symbol of the middle class. It was sipped by ladies in drawing rooms, by writers, by exhausted mothers, even governesses, who were forbidden from having anything extra. The secret was in the dose. No one said, "I take a narcotic." They said, "Just a few drops to help me sleep." And that's exactly how it went. Drops, 5 in tea, 10 in wine. For children, 2 drops, diluted in water. For infants, special syrups like Godfrey's Cordial, Mother's Friend, Dalby's Carminative. All of them contained opium. It was like giving the baby warm milk. Only milk didn't suppress breathing or cause addiction. Morphine gained popularity a bit later, when experiments began isolating it from opium and injecting it subcutaneously. By the 1850s, morphine was no longer rare. It was administered for hysterical fainting, for pains of unknown origin, for nervous conditions. and again, primarily to women. A man with a headache was told to go for a walk. A woman? She received a dose of morphine. Doctors, interestingly, often didn't see any danger in it. One London physician wrote in 1863, "My patient has taken laudanum every night for the past 2 years and is noticeably calmer. Her voice is softer, her mood more even. I believe 80 drops suits her well." 80 drops daily. These prescriptions were rarely noted as ongoing. The doctor might say, "Try this for a few nights." And from there, the woman continued on her own. No supervision, no prescription, but with a growing dependence. Over time, as we'd say today, tolerance developed. It took more to feel the same. And stopping brought something far worse. Anxiety, insomnia, convulsions, obsessive thoughts. So she would return to the pharmacy and ask for just a little more. And what did the apothecary do? He sold it. The law didn't forbid it. In fact, it didn't even restrict it. Not until 1868, when the first Pharmacy Act came into effect, was there any real regulation on opiate sales in England. Even after that, the control was soft. A seller could refuse, but didn't have to. And if a regular client walked in saying, "the usual," he already knew how many drops she needed. From time to time, newspaper notices appeared. A lady from a respectable family died in her sleep. A powerful remedy is suspected, but most of the time, it was kept quiet. In a society where propriety mattered more than truth, no one wanted to talk about the fact that behind a refined woman's smile, there might be an opium haze. Meanwhile, home medicine cabinets were growing. Women kept their tinctures on dressing tables next to perfume, sometimes in sewing boxes, sometimes under the pillow. And occasionally, the bottles were even beautiful. Laudanum came in elegant packaging, with engraved labels and porcelain caps. It was no longer just medicine. It was part of daily life. A ritual, but look closely, and beneath the ritual, you can hear a quiet moan. Society built a world in which women were not permitted to express pain openly, and so they were allowed, even encouraged, to numb it, to purchase something that dulled not only the pain, but also the will. In the rooms of a Victorian home, silence reigns. Only the faintest rustle, the hems of dresses gliding across the floor. Conversations are hushed, voices tender, expressions calm. A smile, barely there. Everything here is designed not to disturb. Not the husband reading in his study, not the children preparing for exams, not the servants whose shadows should go unseen. The woman in this house is like air, expected to be everywhere and invisible. In mid-19th century England, a woman wasn't just expected to behave a certain way. Her very essence, her natural role, as the philosophers put it, was one of silent service. Femininity was idealized through the lens of serenity, modesty, and self-sacrifice. To be a good wife meant to be quiet. To be a good mother meant to be patient. To be a good woman meant to be unnoticeable. Within this framework, society shaped its attitude toward female suffering. Physical pain, anxiety, fatigue, postpartum depression. None of it inspired pity. Quite the opposite. It was seen as natural, not a sickness, not a deviation, but simply part of a woman's lot, like menstruation, miscarriages, night feedings, and aching legs after hours of standing. They wrote, "A true woman bears everything with noble composure. And if she doesn't, then she is either hysterical and therefore dangerous, or spoiled and therefore laughable." But where did this belief come from? It began in childhood. Girls were taught not to whine, to cry only in private, to never complain, especially not to men. Politeness above feeling, decorum above pain. And when such a girl became a wife, she was not meant to speak of her discomfort. If she felt unwell, she was quietly led to another room. If she fainted, she was given smelling salts. If she couldn't sleep, opium. But no one said, "You have the right to feel this." Far more often, they said, "Here's something to make you stop showing it." And so, a dangerous paradox emerged. A woman might suffer, but had no right to suffer openly, which meant her pain was invisible, and invisible pain does not invite compassion. It only calls for the removal of symptoms. Here lies a subtle but crucial element, the social approval of pharmaceutical self-care. To say you were taking laudanum was not shameful. On the contrary, it signaled that you were managing things properly, that you knew the rules, that you were following advice. You didn't cry, you didn't scream, you didn't complain. You simply took your drops and smiled again. Even the art of the period reflects this. Look at the portraits. Women with closed expressions, folded hands, faint smiles, relaxed poses. None of them looks directly at the viewer, as if to say, "I'm here, but I won't intrude." Even in literature, heroines often fall ill quietly, not so much dying as fading away. Maintaining this ideal required constant internal discipline, control over the body, which hurt, control over the soul, which cried, control over the voice, which longed to rise. And into this fragile restraint stepped the medicines. They didn't heal, but they helped her endure. And in society's eyes, that was enough. That's why dependency went unnoticed. The woman wasn't running through the streets in search of a fix. She wasn't causing scenes. She simply went to the pharmacy, or asked a servant to buy a bottle, or ordered it along with her cosmetics. Everything looked proper. But inside, there was darkness. A chemical veil drawn over pain, anxiety, disappointment, loneliness. All the things she could not speak. All the things she could not show. All the things she had to numb. Thus ended the first chapter of this story. Women, surrounded by silk, perfume, and porcelain, slowly dissolved in the haze of medicines prescribed for their comfort. And society looked on with admiration, because they were perfect, quiet, calm, flawless. The fire is low, its orange glow flickering across the wooden floorboards. Somewhere a child cries, soft, rhythmic, like waves lapping against the shore. The mother, exhausted from a day of ironing, sewing, hosting, and bearing the unspeakable weight of daily life, reaches for a small bottle. It's familiar. It lives on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the pepper and the prayer book. She unscrews the cap, pours a careful dose into a spoon, dilutes it with water, and lifts it to the baby's lips. The crying stops, almost instantly, just like every night. This wasn't a scene of desperation, not yet. This was routine, comfort, even responsibility. For countless women in Victorian Britain, opium wasn't some dark indulgence or illicit escape. It was medicine. It was motherhood. It was survival. By the 1850s, products like Godfrey's cordial Mother's Friend and Dalby's Carminative could be found in nearly every home across England. These weren't fringe concoctions sold in back alleys. They were sold openly in pharmacies, grocers, and even general stores. Some were sweet and syrupy, some bitter, but all had one thing in common. They contained opium. And plenty of it. To be fair, people didn't think of it as a narcotic in the modern sense. Opium was seen as a benign remedy, akin to a cup of chamomile tea, just stronger, more reliable, and with a mysterious power to soothe everything from teething pain to colic, headaches, female troubles, or plain old melancholy. What's astonishing is not merely the accessibility of these concoctions, but how deeply they embedded themselves into the rhythms of domestic life. For Victorian mothers, especially those in the working class, they offered a kind of miraculous relief. A baby who wouldn't sleep, who kept them from their chores or rest, could be lulled into silence with a spoonful of Godfrey's. No fighting, no crying, no punishment. Just peace. But what price peace? Let's talk dosage. A typical bottle of Mother's Quietness contained between 1 and 2 grains of opium per fluid ounce. That's the equivalent of several adult morphine pills in a substance marketed for children. The bottles often didn't carry warnings. No red labels, no instructions on safe limits. If anything, they promised too much. Relieves all pain, brings sleep, calms nerves, like whispered incantations against the chaos of the real world. And women, overworked and underhard, believed them. Why wouldn't they? One woman, writing in a private letter in 1861, recounted how she gave her infant daughter a measure of Dalbys every night at 7 o'clock, lest the child should wake too early and disturb the house. The daughter died before her 3rd birthday. But the woman never blamed the cordial. She was delicate from birth, she wrote, and Dalby helped her smile. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to look back in horror. But this isn't a story of monstrous mothers or ignorant wives. It's a story of a society that had no better answers. Pain was ubiquitous. Childbirth was dangerous. Child-rearing was relentless. Domestic expectations were brutal. There were no psychologists, no safe spaces, no maternity leave. There was just the house and the bottle. And then there were the advertisements. Oh, the advertisements. Printed in local papers and women's journals, they were works of linguistic alchemy. Words like cordial, tonic, elixir danced across the page, accompanied by cherubic illustrations of sleeping babies, smiling mothers, and reassuring fonts. No mention of addiction. No word of risk. Only calm, cure, comfort. One particularly popular ad for soothing syrup read, "A friend to every family." A nursemaid in every drop. In hindsight, it's chilling. Apothecaries, too, played their role. Unlike physicians, they rarely questioned a customer's need. You didn't need a diagnosis to buy a tincture of laudanum. You didn't even need to explain yourself. Just a polite request and a few pence. It was medicine for the people, or so they thought. Even as early medical reports began to hint at the dangers of prolonged opium use, especially in children, little changed. A report in 1868 estimated that in Manchester alone, nearly 1 in 5 infant deaths among the working class involved opiate preparations, but few took action. After all, the alternative was a crying child, a sleepless night, a breakdown in the gears of domestic labor. It wasn't evil. It was inertia. It was exhaustion. And it was a culture that taught women to endure silently, gracefully, and chemically. We often imagine history as driven by battles and parliaments. But here, the battlefield was a nursery, the weapon, a spume, and the casualties, invisible, buried in the records of failure to thrive and unexplained fever. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how these over-the-counter opiates became specifically gendered, how women, more than any other group, were conditioned to see these drugs not as danger, but as duty. Picture a waiting room in a London clinic, 1872. Velvet chairs, polished wood, faint perfume lingering in the air. A woman, perhaps 30, sits stiffly, gloves folded in her lap, eyes downcast. Her complaint is vague. Fatigue, nerves, faintness. The doctor listens solemnly, then scribbles a note. A tonic, he writes. Something to strengthen the nerves, restore composure. She leaves with a small bottle in her handbag, amber glass clinking faintly. No questions asked, no examination required. Only the unspoken understanding. She needs it, and she be back. By the 1870s, opium use was no longer just a household ritual. It was a gendered prescription. Society had quietly decided that women, in particular, required a certain kind of chemical tranquility. If men were allowed rage, action, and movement, women were granted stillness, calm, sleep, drowsy compliance. Victorian medical culture pathologized femininity itself. To be a woman, particularly a refined woman, was to be delicate, unpredictable, emotionally porous. Nervous disorders were practically a rite of passage. A young girl might faint at a ball, experience mood swings during her courses, weep uncontrollably after childbirth. And rather than consider these reactions products of biology, environment, or psychology, doctors often turn to a single convenient word: nerves. Nervousness in Victorian parlance was an elastic, ever-expanding concept. It covered insomnia, headaches, digestive issues, boredom, irritability, and anything that threatened the ideal of the serene, graceful lady. And when you create a condition with such a wide net, it's very easy to sell a cure. That cure, of course, was pharmacological, and the pharmaceutical market responded with enthusiasm. Entire brands emerged targeting women specifically. Vang Mariani, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Bliss's nerve tonic. Their names sounded gentle, benevolent, almost maternal. Their ingredients, however, were less so. Opium, morphine, chloral hydrate, alcohol, and sometimes, for an added kick, cocaine. But this wasn't framed as dangerous. It was domestic, appropriate. These weren't drugs. They were part of being a woman, a civilized woman, a tired woman. And therein lies the brilliance and the cruelty of Victorian pharmaceutical culture. It offered women just enough relief to survive their roles, but never enough space to question them. Middle and upper-class women, in particular, were expected to maintain the appearance of health, even when crumbling inside. They weren't allowed to scream or sob in public, but they could faint, a respectable breakdown. They couldn't abandon their families, but they could lie down in darkened rooms. And in those rooms, more often than not, there was a small bottle, amber, corked, waiting. It wasn't simply that society approved of drug use among women, it encouraged it. Pain was normalized, and silence was rewarded. And medication became the elegant solution to an unspeakable truth. The emotional toll of being a woman in a world that didn't hear you. The contradiction is chilling. Public discourse lauded women's resilience, their inner strength, their natural capacity for caregiving. But privately, it drugged them into passivity. A well-medicated woman was a quiet woman. A quiet woman was a good woman. And the pattern crossed class lines, just differently. While the middle class was swallowing patent medicines from the chemist, working-class women relied on cheaper, cruder versions. Laudanum by the drop, syrups bought in brown paper. A shilling here, a penny there. For a mother with 6 children, no help, and another on the way, opium wasn't indulgence, it was fuel. One doctor in Birmingham wrote in 1865, "I have known mothers give their infants opiates so they might go out to work in the mill or sleep through the noise of the tenement." It's easy to moralize, harder to understand, even harder to forgive the society that left them no better options. And yet, as dependence grew, most women didn't realize it. They were told they were weak and that this would make them strong. They were told they were sick and that this would make them well. When symptoms returned, it wasn't read as withdrawal. It was nerves again. And so the cycle continued. The gendered marketing didn't just stop at the label. It shaped identity. Women weren't just taking the medicine. They were becoming the patients it described, delicate, tired, emotionally irregular, in need of managing. The medicine, in essence, wrote their script. Advertising in the Victorian age was not subtle, but it was sophisticated. It spoke not to the mind, but to the emotion. And when it came to women, it spoke especially to exhaustion, to expectation, to that quiet internal scream that says, "I can't do this anymore, but I must." This is where the true genius of 19th century pharmaceutical marketing revealed itself. The problem wasn't pain. It was the woman who couldn't bear it gracefully. The problem wasn't sadness. It was the woman who showed it. And into this moral framework, entered as savior in a glass bottle. These tonics didn't just treat symptoms. They promised to preserve the ideal, to help women remain composed, elegant, devoted, soft-spoken. A civilized woman didn't lash out. She took a tonic. She didn't sob. She sipped her cordial. She didn't defy. She endured. The marketing materials leaned heavily into imagery that reinforced these roles. Women were always pictured indoors, in parlors, bedrooms, or shaded gardens. They were never active, never angry, never ambitious. They were tired, lovely, grateful. Some of the most popular products included Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, marketed for infants, but just as commonly taken by mothers. Its tagline: soothes the child and gladdens the heart of the mother. Veng Mariani, a coca-infused wine endorsed by royalty and even the Pope. Elegant, decadent, restorative. Dr. James Fever Powder contained antimony, sometimes opium. Advertised as entirely safe for delicate constitutions. Bliss's Nerve Tonic, pitched directly at middle-class housewives. Return to your duties with renewed strength and a smiling face. None of these ads warned of addiction. None even hinted at caution. Instead, they invoked phrases like trusted by thousands, gently fortifying, beloved by ladies of refinement. To challenge the product was to challenge your own femininity. It wasn't just what was said. It was who said it. Many of these products carried invented endorsements, fabricated testimonials from fictional countesses or concerned mothers. Others paid real physicians to lend their names, or more commonly, had pharmacists distribute them directly, sidestepping doctors entirely. Medical science at the time was still coalescing. The professionalization of medicine was happening in real time, and for many Victorians, there wasn't a clear line between a licensed physician and an entrepreneurial quack. So if a tonic claimed to be doctor-approved, that was enough. And then there were the ingredients, often deliberately obscured. The word opium might not appear anywhere on the label. Instead, a proprietary botanical extract or calming vegetal infusion. Cocaine became erythroxylum. Morphine became morphia. Alcohol, if mentioned, was preservative. By cloaking these drugs in respectable language, manufacturers erased their danger and, more importantly, their social stigma. A woman wasn't drugging herself. She was taking medicine for her health, for her family, for society. Even the packaging reinforced this illusion. Bottles came in decorative boxes with silk linings. Labels were printed in gold leaf or script fonts, echoing perfume or face cream branding. You could display these on your vanity without shame. They were part of the feminine arsenal: rouge, powder, and painkiller. This commercial ecosystem, chemists, copywriters, doctors, advertisers, worked in unspoken coordination. They didn't conspire maliciously. Rather, they responded to demand. And the demand was clear. Women needed relief, but only the kind that kept them beautiful and quiet. It's worth pausing here. We often ask, how could women not have known? How could they accept this so blindly? But that question underestimates the power of sustained messaging, especially when it aligns with every other force in your life. Your priest says to suffer quietly. Your husband praises you when you smile. Your doctor says your nerves are sensitive. The ad in your magazine says this syrup will help. And it does help, until it doesn't. But by then, it's far too late to stop. Her hands tremble slightly as she buttons her gloves. She's tired, though she's slept nearly 12 hours. Her thoughts feel thick, like wading through syrup. She loses her words sometimes. Her temper, too. Where she placed her keys. Whether she's already taken her tonic. Whether she's spoken out loud or only thought about speaking. Her husband grows distant. Her doctor tells her to rest. And the bottle? It gets lighter faster these days. But she doesn't worry. It's medicine. She trusts it. By the late 19th century, a quiet transformation was underway, not in laboratories or lecture halls, but in parlors, kitchens, and bedrooms. The very medicines women had been told would restore them were beginning to unmake them, and almost no one noticed. At first, the signs of dependency were easy to miss. After all, many of them mirrored the original symptoms for which the drugs had been prescribed: fatigue, irritability, sadness, tension, disrupted sleep. A woman might return to her physician, saying the tonic no longer helped her rest, and the solution was simple: increase the dose. It was a feedback loop, elegant in its cruelty. The drug caused the symptom justified the drug. And remember, these weren't illicit drugs in secret vials. These were beautiful bottles, sometimes monogrammed, given as gifts. Opium was respectable. Morphine was refined. Cocaine-infused wine was Parisian. So when a woman grew pale, lethargic, anxious, distracted, no one thought, "She's addicted." They thought, "Poor dear. Her nerves again." The physical dependency deepened slowly. A few more drops. A second spoonful before bed. Perhaps a dose mid-morning, just to smooth the edges. But the real shift was psychological. Women began to feel incapable of functioning without their tonics. It wasn't euphoria they sought. It was equilibrium. The ability to manage the day, to fulfill the role, to not collapse. Husbands noticed changes, but misread them. "She's distant," they said. Not herself. Children grew nervous around their mothers, not because they were dangerous, but because they were unpredictable. One moment tender, the next distracted. Sometimes awake until dawn, other times unable to rise from bed. And still, no one suspected addiction. There were whispers, of course. A woman might be described as troubled, melancholy, frail. Neighbors would comment on how rarely she left the house, how thin she had become, how quiet. But it was easier and far more acceptable to blame the constitution than the cure. Doctors often failed to help. Some didn't recognize the signs. Others, faced with a patient growing worse, simply rotated medications. If opium lost its power, try chloral hydrate. If that caused agitation, try bromide. And so the chemical carousel turned, while the woman at its center faded further into dependency. But not everyone was silent. There were warnings, scattered like footprints in the fog. In 1877, a London newspaper published a brief obituary. Mrs. H., widow of a naval officer, passed peacefully in her home after a prolonged illness. Her devoted use of medicinal restoratives, though intended for comfort, may have hastened her decline. A coded way of saying, she died from her medicine. In 1882, the Lancet Journal published a rare editorial urging caution. The modern lady is beset not by physical labor, but by spiritual disquiet, for which she turns too readily to narcotic solutions. The body endures, but the mind dims. And in a private letter from 1886, a governess wrote to her sister, "Madam takes her cordial earlier now, even before breakfast. She forgets things. Her mood is brittle. I believe she is not well, but she will not let me call the physician again. She says it is only her nerves." But these voices were small, scattered, and easily drowned out by the larger narrative, that women were fragile, that medicine was gentle, and that silence was strength. And let us not forget, many women themselves didn't realize what was happening. Dependency didn't feel like addiction. It felt like normal, like getting through the day, like breathing through silk. And by the time the fog began to thicken, it was often too late to clear. There were no treatment centers, no vocabulary for withdrawal, no safe conversations. To admit that your medicine had become your master was to invite disgrace, judgment, possibly institutionalization. So instead, they stayed quiet. They stayed at home. And they kept taking the tonic. Imagine a quiet bedroom, drawn curtains, filtered daylight. A journal lies half open on the desk, its pages delicately inked with sloping cursive. "Today I feel better," the writer notes. The pain is dimmer, though I know it waits behind the glass. And just beneath the line, 2 doses this morning, no more. No more, unless the headache returns. These were not the voices of revolutionaries or radicals. They were school teachers, seamstresses, governesses, widows, countesses, women whose names are mostly lost to time, but whose words remain, tucked inside journals and letters, folded neatly in archives and footnotes. Their accounts offer something the medical records of the time rarely do: the interior world. A portrait of what it felt like to live with the medicine, and eventually within it. One of the earliest and most poignant voices belongs to Sarah H., a widow from Devonshire, who began keeping a pain journal in 1869. Her entries at first are precise, hopeful. "The tincture is working now. My limbs feel light. I walk to the garden without holding the rail." But within months, the tone begins to shift. "I take it now not for pain, but for quiet, for sleep, to escape the restlessness that wakes with me. And then, much later, I feel a distance growing between me and my body, as though I watch my days instead of living them." This theme of detachment runs like a quiet chord through many of these accounts. For women already confined by societal roles, silenced, softened, seated, the narcotic calm did not feel unnatural. It felt like fitting in. Emily F., a governess in Yorkshire, wrote to her sister in 1882, "I find the cordial helps me appear as I must, alert, kind, undemanding. Without it, I am brittle. I break. I cannot afford that." She adds in a later letter, "Sometimes I wonder if I am myself when medicated, or only a version of myself made suitable for this household." Here we see the quiet tragedy, not just the physical dependency, but the identity erosion. The medicine didn't rob them of reason. It chipped away at the contrast, blurred the emotional outlines. Life became easier to bear, yes, but also harder to feel. There were moments of lucidity, too, moments when women recognized the pattern forming. Clara R., a middle-class mother of 4 in London, wrote in her diary, "I notice that I forget things now, names, conversations. I laugh more, but I cannot recall why. Is this happiness, or its echo?" Even more haunting is a brief note scribbled in the margin. "If I skip a day, I feel as though I am slipping off the edge of myself." These were not hysterics or addicts in the sensationalized sense. These were articulate, thoughtful women who kept house, taught classes, raised children. And what emerges again and again is a sense of resigned reliance. They understood, in some way, that the medicine both helped and harmed, but they saw no alternative. One particularly moving record comes from Eleanor W., a rector's wife in Kent, whose private letters were discovered years after her death. In a letter to her cousin, she writes, "I no longer take the drops for pain. The pain has become part of me. I take them to soften the sharpness of my thoughts." She signs off, "Do not worry. I remain perfectly civil." That last line is chilling in its composure. Civil, the great Victorian virtue, but what it often meant was numb. What these voices tell us, in soft, careful language, is that women of the time didn't necessarily see themselves as ill or addicted. They saw themselves as managing households, husbands, grief, disappointment, aging. The medicine wasn't rebellion, it was maintenance. And they were, above all, grateful. Grateful that something existed to quiet the ache. Grateful to have a solution that didn't draw attention. Grateful to function. One letter, unsigned, found in a bundle of documents in a private London archive, reads, "There is a great mercy in the drops. I feel no need to weep now. I smile again at breakfast, even when I feel I am far from the table. A mercy, That word appears again and again. Mercy, not cure, not joy, not recovery. Just enough kindness to continue. But the tone shifts as the century turns. In later entries and letters, especially post-1880s, a sense of unease grows. The medicines no longer work quite as gently. The headaches return. The tremors begin. Some women speak of fogginess, of a narrowing of thoughts, of being underwater. Yet even here, most do not stop. By the final decades of the 19th century, the consequences of widespread opiate use, particularly among women, were becoming harder to ignore. While polite society continued to speak in euphemisms, the ledgers of hospitals and asylums told a starker story. Admissions for vague nervous complaints were climbing. Doctors began noticing that some of their best-dressed, most composed female patients were exhibiting a strange constellation of symptoms. Tremors, confusion, digestive issues, wild emotional swings, chronic insomnia. No fever, no injury, no trauma. And yet something was clearly wrong. In early medical journals, these women were often diagnosed with morphinism, a term meant to describe chronic morphine use, which by now had surpassed raw opium as the most common vector. In some cases, doctors used the gentler label of nervine exhaustion, a condition supposedly caused by excessive modern mental strain in women of a sensitive disposition. Others used the phrase laudanum habit as though the behavior was a quaint indulgence, like tea or novels. Still, others began linking such cases to the overprescription of nervous tonics by unlicensed apothecaries, trying gently to shift blame away from the women and toward the system that surrounded them. But not all physicians were sympathetic. A growing number of medical men, particularly those trained in emerging psychiatric institutions, began to view female addiction through the lens of moral weakness. The logic was chillingly familiar. If a woman had fallen into dependence, it was because her nature, emotional, unstable, pleasure-prone, had made her vulnerable. Not the medicine, not the prescribing doctor, her. This logic led to disturbing consequences. In multiple documented cases, women were institutionalized not because they were a danger to others, but because their families or doctors feared they had become socially inappropriate. They wept too easily. They talked too quickly. They neglected appearances, or they asked for more medicine. At the Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, known more famously as Bedlam, a small but growing number of female patients in the 1880s had one phrase repeated in their case files: history of tonic use, emotional instability. Treatment, restraint and observation. Restraint, in this case, meant literal confinement. A quiet woman, medicated into compliance, could be celebrated. But a woman who demanded her drugs, who no longer whispered, but pleaded, was no longer welcome in drawing rooms. She belonged to the asylum. It was only when these cases reached a certain volume that the medical press took serious notice. In 1888, the British Medical Journal published a lead article titled, "The Hidden Perils of the Drawing Room, a Study of Female Medicinal Habits." The article warned of the dangerous over-reliance upon soothing preparations among the female bourgeoisie and called for greater awareness among general practitioners, particularly those serving women of delicate means and respectable family. It was not, in tone, an accusation. It was more of a lament that good women were falling into bad habits, and that physicians must find ways to help them without embarrassment. One suggested remedy: switch from morphine to codeine, a less potent cousin, believed at the time to be non-addictive. History would later correct that assumption. Meanwhile, in provincial hospitals and workhouses, the picture was starker. Working-class women were more likely to be dismissed as hopeless cases or habitual invalids. They were not treated with the same careful euphemisms. Their addiction was visible and therefore less tolerated. An 1883 Glasgow infirmary record notes of one patient, widow, age unknown, has taken Godfrey's cordial daily for over a decade, presents with liver damage, confusion, tremor, refuses tonic substitutes, prognosis, poor. There was no obituary, no whispered sympathy, just another line in the book. Still, a few progressive doctors began advocating for reform, not just in treatment, but in language. Dr. Alice Vickers, one of the rare female physicians of the era, wrote in 1891, "We cannot moralize a condition we ourselves create. If medicine leads to dependence, it is not merely the weakness of the patient, it is the ignorance of the prescriber." Her voice, though small, would echo into the next century. Yet for most of the Victorian era, the medical response remained deeply ambivalent. Doctors oscillated between sympathy and scorn, compassion and condescension. They were, after all, complicit, and to admit fault was to question an entire architecture of care, one that had medicated a generation of women into submission. She had always been composed. That was the word neighbors used, composed. Her curtains were always drawn at the proper time. Her gloves matched to the season. Her children, polished, polite. But that morning, she screamed. Outside, in full daylight, at the grocer, no one could make out the words. Just that they were wrong. Not ladylike, not quiet, not her. By the 1890s, the genteel fog that had long settled over Victorian households began to ripple, not violently, not everywhere, but often enough to stir unease. Because while many women remained ghost-like in their dependence, sleepy, fragile, drifting, a small but growing number began to slip the mask. And when they did, society didn't ask, "What caused this?" It asked, "What is she?" The answer, increasingly, was mad. The transition was swift. A woman who had been described for years as delicate might, after one outburst, be called unstable, dangerous, even depraved. And often, that shift came not because she changed, but because she began expressing something real. Pain, rage, confusion. A resistance, however faint, to the quiet role she had been drugged into playing. Take the case of Mrs. Margaret Langley, a well-known matron in Brighton. For years, she had been treated for nervous conditions with morphine injections, administered by her private physician. Neighbors described her as elegant, slightly aloof, prone to faint spells. But in 1892, she began behaving erratically, forgetting appointments, contradicting her husband at dinner, laughing at inappropriate moments. The local paper later reported, Mrs. Langley, formerly known for her reserved disposition, caused a scene in the apothecary's shop, insisting loudly that she had been given a weaker tonic than usual. She was later taken to a private sanatorium for rest. She never returned home. The language used in these cases was always coded. Rarely was the word addiction applied. Instead, doctors wrote of mental disturbance, emotional degeneration, or the chillingly vague, loss of feminine instinct. But what they feared was not illness. It was disobedience. The woman who smiled through morphine was tragic. The woman who demanded more? Unruly. The woman who wept quietly in a dark room was dignified. The one who slammed doors, raised her voice, or, worse, showed up at her physician's home? A liability. In medical journals, a new narrative began to take shape, that some women had allowed themselves to become slaves to pleasure through careless use of opiates. The nervous lady trope, once sympathetic, was now treated as a cautionary tale. These women weren't unwell. They were weak, immoral, undisciplined. They had violated the single most sacred Victorian rule, self-control. One harrowing account from 1895 involves Jane E., a milliner from Manchester, who had relied on laudanum for over a decade. Her employer described her as soft-spoken and skilled. But after missing several days of work, she returned wild-eyed, begging for advances on her pay. Unable to focus, shaking. When asked what was wrong, she replied simply, "The bottle is empty." She was dismissed that afternoon and admitted to a workhouse infirmary later that week. Her diagnosis? Melancholic frenzy, self-induced. And yet, what strikes the modern reader is how predictable these collapses were. Of course, they broke down. Of course, the fog turned to fire. These women had been asked to perform stillness while managing unbearable strain. Their bodies had been taxed by childbirth, overwork, malnutrition. Their emotions stifled, ignored, medicated. And their minds? Slowly eroded by substances that dulled pain only by delaying it. Eventually, something gave way. The real tragedy is not that some women became erratic or dependent. It's that when they did, they were cast out from the very society that had pushed them to the edge. Their suffering was reinterpreted as sin. Their dependency as decadence. No rehabilitation was offered. No sympathy. Just confinement, shame, and distance. There were no support groups, no safe words, no recovery community. Just locked rooms and the phrase, "She's not herself." And yet, these stories were often kept quiet. Families redacted them. Newspapers used initials or euphemisms. Respectability had to be protected, even if it meant burying daughters, wives, mothers under layers of vague language and permanent sedation. The madwoman in the attic, so common in Victorian literature, was not just a Gothic invention. She was real. She was medicated. And she was often not mad at all, just finally unable to maintain the illusion. By the last decade of the 19th century, the genteel haze that had long enveloped female opiate use began to burn off, not because the practice declined, but because it could no longer remain invisible. Too many accidents, too many collapses in carriages, too many rumors about what exactly nervous medicine meant. One of the earliest cases to spark widespread attention occurred in 1893, when Lady Frances Welby, a noted philanthropist, was found unconscious in a church pew during a charity event. She was revived, but the press, unusually direct, reported the presence of a bottle containing laudanum and a hypodermic kit in her handbag. The story made headlines not just because of who she was, but what she represented. A woman of high status, refinement, culture, and undeniable addiction. And if it could happen to her, what did that mean about the rest? This marked the beginning of a subtle but powerful shift. Where once opium had been wrapped in velvet, hidden behind euphemism, respectability, and lace, it was now treated as something unclean, a creeping moral infection, and increasingly a threat. Doctors, now with the benefit of decades of anecdotal evidence, began to acknowledge, publicly, what some had long known privately. These substances could create not just dependency, but collapse. Mental, physical, social. But rather than blaming the system that had prescribed them, or the culture that had demanded women remain silent, society turned its gaze on the women themselves. In medical circles, the concept of the female inebriate began to circulate. Not addict, not patient, but inebriate, a term borrowed from alcohol discourse, and heavy with judgment. The idea was clear. These women had indulged, and now they had fallen, from grace, from civility, from their place. They were no longer sick. They were suspect. What followed was a wave of institutional and legislative responses, often wrapped in the language of protection, but rooted in fear. In 1894, Parliament debated a proposal for stricter regulation of over-the-counter opiates. One MP, Sir Lionel Grenham, said during a public session, "We have allowed our wives and daughters to sip, drop by drop, into stupor. It is time the nation reclaimed its womanhood." Note the phrasing, reclaimed, as though the women themselves had wandered off, seduced by some external evil. There was no discussion of why so many had turned to these substances. No admission of the societal pressures that had made tonics a tool of survival, just moral alarm. Newspapers followed suit, with increasingly dramatic headlines. The poisoning of England's women, The Times, 1895. A new kind of lady, drowsy, daring, and dangerous. Pall Mall Gazette. What lies in her purse? The secret vices of the drawing room. London Illustrated News. The tone was clear. Addiction was no longer a tragedy. It was a scandal. And with that came new social codes. A woman who once would have been offered tea and rest for her nerves was now eyed with suspicion. Housekeepers were instructed to monitor their mistresses. Maids were told to check for hidden bottles. Doctors, now wary of reputational risk, began quietly denying prescriptions or reporting repeat visitors to authorities. The cruelty of this turn cannot be overstated. The very same women who had been encouraged, even expected, to medicate themselves into passivity were now punished for the inevitable consequences. They were no longer paragons of suffering. They were cautionary tales. And the gender divide sharpened. While male addiction, particularly to alcohol or opium, was often treated as an issue of willpower or vice, it carried an undercurrent of expected behavior. A man could fall and rise again, be forgiven, seek treatment, return to public life. But a woman? A woman who lost her grip, who begged for more morphine, who collapsed in a shop, who disappeared into a sanatorium, had, in society's eyes, lost her character. She was no longer desirable, no longer respectable, no longer even entirely feminine. In private correspondence, one physician wrote, "There is something particularly distasteful about a woman who injects herself. Not concerning, not medically complicated, distasteful." And yet, despite the shame, the judgment, and the emerging regulations, women continued to suffer in silence. Many reduced their doses. Some switched to newly available safer alternatives, like bromides or chloral. But the root of the problem, the pressure to be quiet, graceful, endlessly compliant, remained untouched. Even in panic, society never truly questioned why women had turned to opium in the first place. It simply told them, don't let it show. It was not a hospital, exactly. The curtains were silk. The gardens manicured. Breakfast was served in bed on a silver tray. But the doors locked from the outside, and the nurse kept the key in her apron. The patient, a woman of 37, was taking the cure. Her family told the neighbors she had gone for a rest. She would not be mentioned again for 2 years. By the final decade of the 19th century, Victorian England had begun to reckon uneasily with the cost of its medicinal habits. The fog of unregulated opium and morphine use was no longer limited to whispers or scattered tragedies. It had become an institutional reality. But what, exactly, did treatment mean? The answer depended, almost entirely, on class. If a woman was wealthy, or at least comfortably middle class, she might be sent to a rest home or private sanatorium. These establishments were designed to look more like country estates than hospitals. They offered music, books, walks in gardens, light calisthenics, and what was called moral rehabilitation. But they also administered harsh, often condescending routines, ice baths, enforced silence, restricted diets, isolation. And most ironically of all, many continued to use sedatives and alternative opiates as part of the recovery. A woman might be admitted for overuse of laudanum and be treated with a bromide-laced sleeping draught, just a different fog. The famous rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell and later critiqued by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in The Yellow Wallpaper, was a quintessential example. It involved complete bed rest for weeks, total isolation from friends, family, children, a fatty diet to restore the nerves, no books, number writing, no movement, and frequently morphine injections to calm episodes. The idea was to reset the woman as body and mind, not by addressing the underlying pressure, grief, or dependency, but by enforcing stillness. Again, The goal was not healing, but containment. If, however, a woman came from the working class or had no family to manage her, her experience would be far more grim. In municipal asylums and poorhouses, women with symptoms of drug withdrawal or visible breakdown were simply recorded as insane. There was no gentle euphemism, no pastoral garden walks, just overcrowded wards, shared bedding, cold meals, and often restraints. Their charts read coldly: woman, age approx. 40, delirium, agitation, refuses food, previously treated with laudanum, committal ordered by parish authority, condition, degenerative, no privacy, no dignity, no hope. In some asylums, rudimentary detox protocols were attempted: gradual withdrawal, diet changes, herbal infusions. But without understanding why the addiction had occurred, or the societal structures that supported it, these women were simply seen as failed cases. They had fallen short of the ideal. And once their dependency became public, they were no longer considered proper women. Many never left. Some escaped through what was delicately called natural decline. Others, tragically, by suicide. But even those who did return home rarely returned to the life they had known. Their names were tainted, their health fragile, their reputations thin as parchment. In upper-class circles, a woman might re-emerge from a private facility to murmurs of nervous collapse and spend the rest of her life under gentle surveillance, never again trusted to travel alone, raise children, or speak of her past. In working-class families, where labor and survival took precedence, women were more likely to be forgotten altogether. A sister who vanished, a mother who got strange, a grandmother who didn't speak. And always silence. No public memorial, no newspaper tribute, no acknowledgement that what had happened was not a flaw in character, but a systemic design. Doctors, too, began distancing themselves from past practices. By the early 1900s, the language around female addiction grew colder, more clinical. A woman who once might have been described as overcome by her nerves was now labeled a chronic invalid or narcotics case. The kindness, such as it was, faded. In rare cases, women did speak. Memoirs surfaced, anonymous letters. Some warned others, some simply sought understanding. One anonymous article in an 1899 medical journal, written by a recovering patient, read, "They called it recovery, but I do not remember who I was before the bottle. I only know who I pretended to be while I was inside it." That's the cruelest truth of this chapter, that even in recovery, there was no restoration, only recalibration, return to form, re-entry into silence. The Victorian state did not ignore the opium problem, but its response was slow, fragmented, and perhaps most importantly, shaped far more by fear of disorder than by care for the dependent. The first major legal intervention came with the Pharmacy Act of 1868, which for the first time categorized opium and its derivatives as poisons. It required that such substances could only be sold by registered pharmacists and had to be labeled clearly. In practice, this had little effect. Pharmacists continued to sell laudanum and related compounds widely to men, women, even children, because demand remained high and regulation was lightly enforced. Moreover, many tonics and syrups simply rebranded themselves as botanical remedies, burying opium behind Latin or euphemism. And still, no prescriptions were required. The law, though written, had no teeth. A lady in a velvet hat could buy her usual cordial without interruption, so long as she asked nicely and used the right words. It would take decades and rising death rates for real change to begin. By the 1880s and 90s, as press attention turned toward cases of female dependency and child fatalities, public health advocates began to apply pressure. The temperance movement, already active in fighting alcohol, widened its mission Now, opium was a moral threat, not just a medicinal one. Pamphlets began to circulate. The drugged mother, the lost child. Beneath the lace, the hidden poison of ladies' tonics. The language was dire, dramatic, often sensational, and always focused on women. Therein lay the paradox. These new campaigns insisted on protecting women, but their tone was deeply patronizing. They portrayed women not as patients or victims of systemic failure, but as naive innocents who needed guarding from themselves. One well-known moral reformer, Mrs. Clara Booth, gave a speech in 1895 titled, "Guard the Mothers, Save the Empire." She declared, "No home is safe if its mistress lies dulled beneath a doctor's hand." The implication was clear. Opium was a threat to domestic order, not just health. And Parliament responded, slowly and with hesitation. In 1898, further restrictions were placed on opiate sales, particularly in urban centers, requiring better record-keeping and new limits on quantities sold without documentation. Yet again, however, wealth shielded access. Private chemists and doctors continued to offer medications to upper-class clients under soft codes. Nerve tincture, sleep mixture, the usual. At the same time, poor and working-class women began to feel the sting of regulation more sharply. Public chemists became wary of selling to them. Workhouses removed opiates from infirmary supplies. And those who couldn't afford private doctors found themselves suddenly cut off, not supported. No treatment was offered, just withdrawal in the most literal sense. And all the while, no law touched the root of the crisis, the normalization of chronic female pain, the societal demand for emotional silence, the economic and maternal burdens carried almost entirely by women, the cultural expectation that a woman endure, but not express. Her suffering laws targeted substances, not structures. Even in the 1900s, as the Dangerous Drugs Act was being discussed, eventually passed in 1920, the debate remained centered on control, not care. The fear was that England's women might become too unruly, too damaged to fulfill their roles. Addiction was no longer a medical condition. It was a civic risk. And yet, despite these shifts, the underlying logic of Victorian control remained intact. Keep women calm. Keep women contained. If necessary, keep them medicated, but never let them speak of it. One MP famously asked, in 1901, "How shall England raise her sons if her daughters lie in powder and fog?" As though motherhood, not womanhood, was the only concern. The fog was being legislated, but it was not being understood. The turn of the century brought with it not just new regulations, but a new vocabulary. And in that vocabulary, the woman who had long been seen as a passive recipient of treatment was now reimagined as an active participant in her own decline. She had once been overwhelmed. Now she was reckless. She had once been fragile. Now she was corrupted. She had once been a patient. Now she was a problem. The term addict, which entered medical language more firmly around the 1890s, had a distinctly gendered flavor when applied to women. For men, addiction might suggest weakness or vice, but also struggle, redemption, discipline. For women, it suggested decay. Medical texts of the early 1900s speak plainly. The female addict is often found to exhibit moral instability, emotional volatility, and tendencies toward deception. That phrase, moral instability, would become the go-to diagnosis for women who no longer fit inside the quiet, medicated shell they were expected to inhabit. Doctors began to write not of symptoms, but of behavior, not of dosage, but of dignity lost. It was not that the medicine failed the woman. It was that the woman failed the medicine. The most damning evidence of this shift comes from the psychiatric institutions that continued to receive growing numbers of female patients. Case files from 1900 to 1915 show a marked change in tone. A patient in 1890 might be described as Suffering from nervous exhaustion. History of tonic use. Husband reports emotional fragility. A patient in 1910? Addicted to narcotics? Exhibits deceit. Disoriented. Possibly promiscuous. Female, aged 32. The language hardened. The gaze narrowed. And the woman at the center of the file became less real, more symbolic. A warning. A lesson. This was reinforced by the public imagination. Newspapers, novels, even cartoons began to portray addicted women not as tragic, but as failed. Failed mothers, failed wives, failed citizens. One satirical column in Punch magazine, 1907, featured a character named Madame Morpha, who was always late, always dazed, and always lamenting the state of her nerves, while ignoring her children and gossiping at tea. The tone was cruel, dismissive, and unmistakably classist. The addicted woman was no longer pitied. She was laughed at, or feared. She became a symbol, not of medical failure, but moral collapse. And yet, within this bleak reframing, something new stirred. A handful of women, especially those with access to education and publishing, began to push back, quietly, carefully, but unmistakably. Some wrote anonymously to medical journals, describing their symptoms, their isolation, their dependence, not to ask for pity, but to be understood. Others included veiled accounts of narcotic use in novels, poems, and essays, not as scandal, but as confession. Or accusation. The writer E.M. Delafield, best known for The Diary of a Provincial Lady, referred obliquely in personal notes to certain ladies of the shires who relied on drams before breakfast, drops at luncheon, and powders before bed. Her tone was not mocking. It was observational, almost tender. And in private salons and circles, conversations began, cautiously, around what pain really meant, why women carried so much of it, why doctors treated their silence more seriously than their suffering. This wasn't a movement, not yet, but it was the beginning of resistance. And that resistance was grounded in a simple revolutionary idea, that women's pain is real, that their use of medicine was not a flaw, but a survival strategy, and that their voices, long drugged into a whisper, still carried truth. The bottle is empty now. The label faded, the cork hardened. Somewhere, in the back of a cabinet, it sits beside a pair of gloves that no longer fit, a letter never posted, a pressed flower from a garden that no longer exists. Victorian England was an empire of control of land, of time, of labor, of emotion. And no one was expected to embody that control more gracefully, more perfectly than women. They were the keepers of calm, the curators of silence, the guardians of a domestic world that required them to feel everything, but show almost nothing. And so, when pain crept in, physical, emotional, spiritual, the answer wasn't revolution. It was a tonic, a drop, a syrup, a sweet amber mercy. What began as medicine became a mirror. In it, we see not just the quiet suffering of individual women, but an entire system of expectation. One that told them, you must endure, you must be gentle, you must not disturb. And the bottle helped them do just that. Until it didn't. Until the fog thickened. Until the laughter slowed. Until they forgot what they had taken it for in the first place. History didn't mark these women with statues or names etched into stone. There were no marshes, no manifestos, just silence, carefully folded into linen drawers and footnotes. Their stories weren't lost. They were quieted. But if we listen closely, we can still hear them, in the tone of a diary entry, in a line from an old novel, in the way we still talk about pain as something to suppress, not share. And perhaps that says the real inheritance of this story, not just the warning about a bottle, but a question that lingers like perfume in a long abandoned room. Who gets to feel pain? And who is told to keep it down? So tonight, As the world grows quiet and the clock ticks softly on your nightstand, think of the women who lay in their parlors, in their bedrooms, in their locked sanatoriums, not mad, not monstrous, just tired, just trying. And maybe, in some small, still way, remember them. Good night.